Hello and welcome to the latest episode shot at NMIMS Indore. I'm Belina Singh
And I'm Akshat Singh.
and today we're joined by Professor Gerhard Schnyder.
And Professor Gregory Jackson.
So sir, please firstly welcome on our podcast. We're so glad to have you. And firstly we would like to congratulate you on this amazing guest lecture that we had. We had we'd like to tell the audience that we had the session in 2 batches. And still, there were so many people who had so many questions, but there was a little time problem because everyone had to go home. But it was an amazing lecture, and we all really, really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for that. So while we get started on our today's session, we would like to give a little introduction to the audience about our guests today. So firstly, Professor Gerhard Schnyder is a distinguished scholar in the field of comparative management, comparative political economy, and comparative politics. And he's the director of the Institute for International Management at, let's see if we get it right, Loughborough University?
Almost.
Almost? Okay, that's good. So, yes. Could you tell us the pronunciation?
Yeah, so, we just had this discussion. It's actually not that easy because
Okay.
I'm Swiss.
Okay.
So I pronounce it with a Swiss-German accent,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
I call it Loughborough. And I think in my ears, that's as close as I can get to how my English colleagues pronounce it. So, but it's perfectly fine to mispronounce it. There are all sorts of variations of that name out there. And I strongly believe one of the reasons why people don't know about Loughborough University is because the name is so difficult to pronounce, right? And we have had Australian colleagues visiting, talking to us about Loughborough University.
So I like that pronunciation, Loughborough.
It sounds sort of Australian cool, right?
Yeah, it's actually really good.
And Professor Gregory Jackson is Professor of Comparative Management in the Institute for International Management at the Loughborough University, London. His extensive research covers topics such as corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, and employment relations.
All right. Okay. Yes, sir. So, with that little introduction, so our introduction literally covered nothing about how distinguished scholars these 2 people are over here who are joining us today. But firstly, we would like to start off by asking you. So, this is your first time in India?
It is.
It is. It is. How is that experience been like? Especially Indore. You're coming directly Indore, right?
Yes.
So,
Heart of India.
yeah, we're pretty much in the center of India. So how is Indore suiting you guys? How has it been?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's like a dream come true. I've really been fascinated with Indian music and culture and food for a long time. Where I grew up in California, was very near to the Ali Akbar Khan School of Music, which has brought Indian music to the West. And so, yeah, it's kind of, I feel like a bit like in a dream. And I think Indore's been a great place to start this journey because I think it seems like everything that's happening in India you can see here in like a microcosm of so many different people, different languages, cultures coming together. So it's really been inspiring and fascinating so far.
And you, sir, how has your experience been like?
Yeah, excellent so far.
Okay.
I mean, I have to say, so a bit like Gregory, India is a country that's very present in my daily life. I moved to the UK, to England, 15 years ago, and I became a British citizen, right? And to become a British citizen, you have to do this citizenship test, where you learn a lot about the country and its history and whatnot. And obviously, India is a huge part of British history and culture as well.
Right.
So I read quite a bit about India, watched Indian movies. I was telling Gregory about Lagan. I don't know if you remember that movie from the 90s.
We're familiar with that. Yeah.
I don't know. And so coming here and actually having the chance of experiencing it is really excellent. And it's been, people are so friendly and treating us like kings, to be honest. I wonder whether I should move here, to be honest.
I mean, we by nature we love being very hospitable, and I think all of Indians usually. So you know how a caring mother is like. every Indian is like a caring
Is
mother.
okay.
They'll feed you, they'll ask you, are you good? Did you sleep? Did you have something? Would you like to have something? So Indians sort of have that, we're more collectivistic by nature. Yes.
Yeah.
Hospitality has just been amazing, and everyone's
Yes.
so gentle and kind. Yeah.
Yeah, that just comes very naturally. Yes.
Okay, so I think we would like to start it off as how did you develop an interest in your respective fields? As in, for example, for example, you have your research covers corporate governance and CSR activities. So, was there a pivotal moment or an experience in your lifetime that made you bend towards these subjects?
That's a great question. When I was growing up, my mother embarked on a second career and trained to be an X-ray technician working in hospital. And these hospitals in California, they would get bought up by a corporation, and that corporation would buy another corporation, by another corporation. And I think hearing my mother talk about things going on in her work made me kind of sensitive that corporations were somehow powerful, important, they impact people's lives, but it was kind of mysterious to me, like what's this corporation, and so forth. So it's something that I got interested in, I think, from the early age, to understand sort of work, employment, and the role of organizations. And then I also had some experiences as a young person being an exchange student in Germany.
Oh,
and
that's interesting.
and realizing, okay, how the way they do it there is very different. And then I had a later chance to be a research assistant for Ronald Dorr, who's a British expert on Japan, and who kind of further extended my geographic scope. And so I came to appreciate that work and organization, there's some universal aspects about it, but there's always aspects that are very contingent on the context of the history, the politics, the culture, and those differences, matter. They make a difference to people's lives and their welfare, and how you feel at the end of the day.
Sir, I would like to extend the same question to you, that your research is in the field of comparative management, comparative political economy, and comparative politics as well. So I would like to extend the same question to you, that was there a moment in your life that made you interested in these fields?
So a bit similar to Gregory's answer. I mean, it also goes way back in my life, and like in Switzerland, the sort of the moment where I became aware of these questions for the first time, corporate governance in particular, was sort of in the 1980s, where something that we call corporate raiders appeared for the first time. So this is rich people buying up companies to make money, right? Okay. That was a concept that Swiss people couldn't cope with, because companies were run by people who wanted to produce the best possible goods and products that they could be proud of, that they could sell at good returns, but not to maximize the returns on investment. But right? So it was a complete new phenomenon, and like the media were, there were huge debates. Who are these people? And some of them became politically very influential. So this sort of put sort of a seed in my brain, I think, of like, this is fascinating. I mean, who owns corporations is actually crucially important because then if the wrong person buys the company, people get fired, right? And sometimes they can destroy companies, right? And then when I was at university, and then started my PhD actually working on public opinion and referenda in Switzerland, right? Switzerland has these votes every 3 months where people vote on topics, and that's actually what I started studying.
Interesting. So people vote on
every
different
3
topics?
months.
Yeah.
Every 3 months.
Every 3 months there is a popular initiative. So people collect signatures and say, we want to change the constitution so that this topic is being reflected in it. If you get to 150,000 signatures, there will be a popular referendum. So that's what I started studying. But then, I was like, and then one morning I was it's interesting, but at the same time, I was on the tube with on the metro with a
Right.
colleague who told me, "Oh, did you hear this professor got a new grant to study corporate governance?" And I was like, "Corporate what?" And they explained to me, "Yeah, shareholders." And I was like, "Oh wow, that's what I want to do." So when I stormed into his office and said, "You need to hire me for this project," and eventually I wore them down, and they did. And that's why when I realized, politics is crucially important and very interesting, but to me, economics and corporations is so crucial to politics. That's actually the topic I wanted to study. Yeah.
Okay, alright. So I was going through your profile and I did go through so you have a very interesting website that I went through, yeah. And you talked about an institutionalist approach. So could you explain what exactly it meant? I mean, it was very brief, so
Yes,
couldn't get a great idea about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Gregory would probably be much better at explaining it, but I'll start and maybe you can correct me. Institutional approach is really, sort of the way I introduce it to my students is, for a long time, business management was studied often implicitly with the focus very much on the organization, on the company, its strategy and how it works, with sort of the idea, if we know how to run this company, we can apply what we know to any other company, anywhere in time, anywhere in place, right? The institutionalists say, well, hang on, companies are not detached from their environment. They're embedded in societies, in cultures, in political systems, in legal systems. So, whether or not strategy A, B, and C work in context A, B, and C very much depends on institutions. So that's what it means. Institutions being defined here as, these sort of shared norms, shared ways of doing things, or the rules of the games that people agree on, and they very much constrain, how corporations work, and also, what type of management strategy works in a specific context, right?
So what I'm able to gather from it is that if there's a particular environment that is already an institution is working in an environment, that cannot easily be duplicated into another environment. Is that what?
Absolutely.
All right.
That's a very nice way of putting it. Very
I mean, that is something I could gather out of it. Okay, all right. And so, currently, yes, sir, you...
Well, yeah, institutions, it's like a quality of a relationship. It's an expectation that a certain kind of person will do a certain kind of thing, but always in a context, right? So it's very important, those circumstances, and a lot of those circumstances are kind of coincide with the history of a culture or a nation or political entity and so forth. So institutions are sort of infinitely diverse and fascinating to study. Yeah.
So every single institution would have a different history, a different geography, a different culmination of different resources, in fact, to put it together. That is what institutionalist approach would be? All right. Okay, so we got a good idea.
Yes.
All right, okay. So, so basically what from this, what I would like to ask you guys is, that now that, in India, like you mentioned in today's lecture as well, globalization came in the 1990s, right? And a global world's approach was to, I believe it is a little different from institutionalist approach, is to adopt whatever is coming in and duplicate it across different countries and nations. Do you think that is a very valid thing that we did around 30 years ago? Do you think that is still valid in today's world?
Well, what you're describing is institutional theorists would call the diffusion of institutions, usually from, say, the global north or United States or something to other parts of the world, and whether that's leading to a kind of a convergence. And there was a lot of politics behind that. We talked earlier today about the Washington Consensus and the kind of power inequalities of the world, institutions like the IMF or U.S. government, pushing these kind of models. So it was kind of an experiment over some decades to try to replicate the same kind of institutions all over the world, and I think that blatantly, hasn't worked in the way that people expected it to work. Anytime you adapt, if we say an institution is a rule, well, in any circumstance, in any relationship, in any context, a rule always requires interpretation, and will always be a gap to be, filled in. And so a lot of this borrowing of institutions was a little bit naive and led to, kind of unexpected consequences around the world. And I think now we're starting to kind of be more sensitive and learn from that and try to think a little bit more how to construct institutions in a way, maybe kind of in multiple layers that allow more incorporation of bottom-up participation, local knowledge, and the respect for local knowledge. I mean, that's maybe more of a wish list from me, but I think we're kind of at a point in which the sense it's an opportunity now to move in that direction, away from a convergence to one model and more to a kind of spectrum of diversity.
Let's like we're putting it in the way that it is becoming more acceptable of cultural differences and adopting more to that.
Also, Sir Gregory, sir, as we are already on the topic of globalization, and your research covers many countries such as Germany, Japan, and USA. So, how do cultural and institutional differences in these countries influence corporate practices, and what lessons can we learn from them? Would you like to shed light upon that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Japan would be a great illustration of what I was talking about, where there was a kind of a period of time Japan was in a crisis in the late 1990s. The Silicon Valley model in California looked pretty good. People said, we have to kind of chase after that model, right? And then, you have a lot of resistance in Japan from the kind of old guard and the people who are, would lose out by changing those institutions. And in some ways it took so long to change the institutions in Japan that the attractiveness of the American model also started to decline. And we saw, actually it's not such a good model after all, and maybe there's some things we should keep from the old Japanese model. And in some of my writings I describe that as a process of hybridization. It's a little bit of mixing and matching things, but when you recombine elements, like for example different genres of music, you come up with something that can be distinct and creative on its own. And so I think the Japanese pathway is maybe an interesting one of combining old and new elements. It's become more open and transparent, but there's still some kind of core, more traditional practices that have been preserved.
So, what's your take on the same question? Because during the guest lecture, you did mention something about the Nordic countries. That was in particular that they are doing in corporate governance and CSR activities. Nordic countries are doing really well in comparison to other countries. And I guess also there was a point that USA, as you said, is still on the lower side. So, would you like to share something on those lines?
Yeah, so maybe just on this idea of hybridization, right? I mean, maybe this is the answer to the previous question as well, in terms of what we did in the 1990s, is that still relevant? Was it a good way of globalizing? And I mean, my short answer would be no, right? It was the idea really of one size fits all, and it neglects all these local knowledges. It also creates a lot of pushback, right? I mean, if you don't get people on board with the reforms that you want to implement, then you're not getting anywhere, and hence the sort of more participative way of doing reforms is obviously something we need to think more about. And in terms of country differences, and the Nordic countries in particular, it's interesting. I mean, I fundamentally agree with the notion that often, actually part of my PhD was to study Sweden, right, which creates a lot of confusion because I'm from Switzerland, but I studied Sweden, so people were like, which one is it? Which is your country? But Sweden was always a model of its own, and it had such an incredibly well thought through economic system that they called the Rhine-Main model, which was in place from 1959 to 1974 or so, and it was really intellectually thought through. There were many commissions with experts trying to figure out, the different policies that need to be in place for the system to work. And then that sort of was disrupted, right, in the 70s. And now Sweden actually, it still looks very good in your slides, for instance, the CSR performance. But Sweden has gone through a revolution, in political terms. And again, Sweden for the first time is now governed by a party that's considered extreme right, and that was unthinkable until 10 years ago, right? And partly why Sweden came to the point where it has such a radical party in power is because the economic system didn't produce or didn't live up to the promises it made to the people anymore, right? And it created a society that's actually quite dysfunctional to some extent. And so, again, I'm it's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I think it's precisely, things are not stable, right? I mean, I think if you would ask Swedes, what point in time would you like to live in Sweden in? They would probably say sometime in the 60s. It was great, it was perfect. But things don't last. So I think what we need to think about more is not so much how can we preserve things, but rather how can we adapt to the challenges that the world throws at us in the most efficient and the most beneficial way, in a sense, right? But I'm not sure if that answers your question. Shall I have a go at Brexit? And
sure.
Yeah.
I think we both can go ahead.
Yeah. So on Brexit, I mean, this is obviously one of my favorite topics. I'm writing a blog on Brexit as well, and so I mean, it's a hugely fascinating phenomenon. Nobody expected it to happen, including the people who pushed for it. Right? It was a huge surprise, but it showed sort of a fundamental, unease in Western European societies, in the UK in particular. And it sort of shows people feel things are not quite right, and this morning I was talking to students where I said, coming here feels so different because here you get this positivity, this sort of hunger, the, like very ambitious future by 2047, India will be a developed country, whereas in the UK we're struggling with what's happening at the moment, and Brexit is a reflection of that, but it's also added to our problems in terms of cutting us off of the single market. Many businesses go out of business because of it, trade barriers that weren't there before, and whatever you think of the EU, it's been a huge shock to the UK economy. At the same time, the sort of the silver lining, so I'm passionately against Brexit,
Okay, all right.
But at the same time, there is a silver lining in terms of, it does reflect also sort of, the changing world order where, countries like India, but also Brazil and China have moved center stage more, right? And where, the power relations that were so clear up until the 1980s or even before have become, challenged in a sense, right? And it's sort of now, like the British government has this plan of, it's called the Pacific tilt, meaning foreign policy will be more oriented towards the Pacific than the North Atlantic, right? So moving somewhat away from our partners in North Atlantic and we pay more attention to the Pacific region. And for India and the UK, that means a change in the relationship. There's a free trade agreement being negotiated at the moment. It's unsure whether that will ever come off. But it does mean that there's a lot of opportunity for Indians and people from other parts of the world in the UK now that weren't there before Brexit. Because before Brexit, we were very much focused on students from Europe, from Eastern Europe, workers from Eastern Europe, whereas now there's sort of this change, right? And that's to me is very interesting. And maybe the one thing where I'm like, wait, there's some positives to Brexit perhaps.
So what I am able to understand here is that we can see a lot of good things happening for developing countries per se. But how does that situation look like for the UK particularly? Because this was a very big change. Like you said, nobody expected it to happen. So what is the future like? What changes can we expect from there?
I think the UK is in a situation where it really is looking for its place in the world, right? I mean, that's what Brexit sort of symbolized, right? It's like, who are we? We're not the empire anymore, right? We're also not this great manufacturing nation anymore. We're sort of a medium player in a big world. And I mean, I don't know what the future holds, of course, but what I do know is that the UK needs to become much more realistic about its place in the world, and it needs to rebuild, its skill bases and its labor markets in a way that's fairer at the same time, but also more geared towards the industries of the future. Yeah.
Be more adaptive with that.
Yes. Yeah.
And you, sir?
Yeah, well, not so much to Brexit, but this era of globalization. I think Brexit was one manifestation of the kind of end of the era of this globalization, and globalization was based on a kind of idea that by having free and open trade, a flow of culture, that it would have a kind of civilizing, aspect and bring people closer together. And you see that, when you have an unregulated kind of market process, there's winners and losers, and global inequality has continued to increase both within countries, like within, say, the UK labour market, but also between countries. And this creates the kind of political, fissures and kind of cracking apart and fragmentation of political system that in Western democratic countries it's very difficult to reach any kind of political consensus. And then you see countries like UK or countries where you have a rise of populism. People long believed that by integrating Russia into the Western markets that would guarantee kind of peace and stability. And we've really kind of passed that point, and a lot of scholars talk about we've now entered into an area of deglobalization.
Yes.
And the problem with that is that at the same time we're facing the grand challenge of climate change, which is
Global
probably
impact.
the most global one, where we need that kind of cooperation. So we're really kind of at a crossroads of how to come together politically, culturally, to cooperate, and I think it needs to be something where you have the role of countries like India as a large democratic, but people say emerging economy. It seems pretty emerged to me, but new player at the table might change the discussion and bring new ideas and play a greater role. But it's exciting and sometimes a little bit frightening time. But I think there's a lot of challenges that we can improve our lives by addressing them.
I would like to ask both of you about the future of corporate governance. As in, how do you see it? In which direction is it moving towards? Especially because the global business landscape is changing, is evolving. So how do you see it?
Yeah, so I don't know. The way it should go, in my view, normatively speaking, is towards a broader understanding of economic wealth, in a sense, right? So the corporate governance system we have is a product of the 80s and 90s, and it's still very much focused on making money for shareholders, right? And I think we're at a point in the history of the world where the problems, the grand challenges have become so big that we need something quite different to address these challenges. Corporations are amongst the most powerful actors in the world, including governments, right? So some corporations are more powerful than many governments, right? And we desperately need them to start behaving in a way that corresponds with the power they have, right? The responsibility has to correspond with the power. And so the EU had an interesting attempt at making corporate governance sustainable. environmentally, but also in other respects. And they commissioned a report from EY, the consultancy firm, which was surprisingly and refreshingly critical of the current system. It drew a lot on the sort of research that we do. They may even quote some of your work. They quote loads of people, who work in the space of corporate governance, comparative, but also the short-termism and things like that. And the report was very strongly attacked by people in the field, by law professors, for instance, for saying this is all nonsense. Shareholder value is the only thing that can really guide managerial activity. So we need to stick with that. We can make it slightly less harmful, but we need to stick with it. So that was, to me, the reaction was quite a shock. And obviously, I don't think this reform will go anywhere. So I think that's the direction it has to go into. And I think the key question that we need to ask is not just where do we have to go, but how can we get there, right? And this episode from the EU is sort of, shows you where the resistance lies. And, we need to start thinking about, why do people push back against this? And, how can we create an understanding for the need for change?
Yeah, picking up on that, I think there's a growing sentiment in the business world that businesses do need to be sustainable, socially responsible, and maybe the problem is people want to develop that as a business case. So they want to do it to the extent that it's profitable and to a certain extent, and kind of develop the win-win solutions. And I think there's some limitations to that kind of dominant thinking that I don't think it's enough to sort of save the planet or ultimately to change the world, because the part that's missing from the discussion are the kind of distributional questions. And if you say want to scale back the fossil fuel-based automobile production and put something else in place, that's a huge kind of transformation, and there's going to be winners and losers to those things, and the question is sort of how you manage that transition. And a lot of the I talked about in my talk today here at your university that a lot of the proclamations of responsible business and so forth are not really being implemented very deeply. And I think to make that implementation deeper, it needs to be more than the top management promising, well, yeah, we'll look after it, or we'll get around to reducing emissions sometime. And you need a model of governance that's somehow more internally democratic and involves more different stakeholders, not just with we promise to be responsible to you, but giving sort of rights to those people, right? And you see the kind of some models, global models emerging from Rana Plaza. I mean, it's just a very small issue, but the accords that came after the Bangladesh and trying to involve, say, the local people in Bangladesh, at the kind of end of the supply chain, unions, governments, and these are very little experiments we can see in trying to find a different model of governance, which is more kind of inclusive and a bit more global in the scale. So those are things that interest me to try to understand better and try to find some wisdoms in those models.
Yeah, I think I totally agree to the last bit that you said, especially about inclusivity and developing a global workforce in that matter. And yeah, that has been a pretty interesting subject here that both of you have enlightened us about. So with that, I think we'll come to the end of the podcast. It has been a very pretty interesting episode, and it might have stretched on a little too long, and we hope you were not bored with us. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, absolutely.
It's great to talk with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Any last words, sir, about NMIMS or anything that you would like to say to our audience who will be watching this?
Or any advice that you would like to give to NMIMS students?
Yes, so again, I mean, the sort of increasingly what I feel, I'm really grateful for your enthusiasm, I mean, the fact that you keep us in this room for so long, right? It's really encouraging, and I mean, my sort of plea to you is keep up the optimism and the enthusiasm, I mean, old grumpy people like me and Gregory, it's refreshing to see, like, despite all the problems we discuss, we analyze, we study, there's still people who are optimistic about the future, and I think that's crucially important to go forward.
I mean, we're still living, our life is very, very small. We've spent a very little part of our life yet. So we have a huge part to look ahead to. So I think if we would not be optimistic, it would be very difficult
That's
to go
absolutely
on.
true. Yeah.
Yes. But yes, sir, it has been a very interesting episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope everyone has a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.